Welcome, everybody, to this webinar for the Cambridge Disinformation Summit. This one's going to discuss capital market implications of disinformation, and Brad Badisher, who's joining with me in a moment, will introduce our speakers. I'm Alan Jagelinzer. I'm the professor of financial accounting. I also co-direct the Center for Financial Reporting and Accountability at the Cambridge Judge Business School. I'm joined with Brad Badisher, who's the Deloitte Foundation Department Chair of Accountancy and the Deloitte Professor of Accountancy at the Mendoza College of Business at University of Notre Dame. He's going to lead the discussion and facilitate that with our presenters, and he'll introduce them in a moment. The idea behind the summit was to bring people together, scholars, practice partners, practitioners, people who are working in different disinformation environments, so that we can actually amplify our research across our research domains and learn from each other. I've reached out to psychologists, for example, authoritarian studies professors, to learn more about what they're doing so that we can actually think about disinformation holistically and consider the implications for society as well as business. Some definitions that might help with the discussions, and I borrow this from the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity. There's a link with the code if you're interested in this paper, but this aligns with other definitions that are floating out there. Misinformation is false information that is not intentionally put out there to cause harm. It may be mistakenly put out there, or it may follow somebody who has put out disinformation, which is false information that is intentional to manipulate and harm others. It's trying to steer some outcome. Malinformation is information that may actually have truth in it, but it's potentially exaggerated or communicated out of context, also to cause potential harm. And sometimes we use disinformation and misinformation in these discussions and we bleed over, but the key distinction, as I noted earlier, is intention. We're hosting the summit the 27th and the 28th of July in Cambridge to bring together a lot of people who are in practice and or are doing research around disinformation. Our keynote will be Frances Hogan, who's most known for whistleblowing with Facebook. We have leading people from management, from authoritarian studies, computer science, and AI. We have politicians. We have practice partners in audit and fact checking, including Africa Check. The Australian e-safety commissioners coming out. We have law professors discussing sort of the boundaries between free speech and platform accountability, because that gets into constitutional law, and it's a pretty gray area. And that's an analogous environment for what we do in financial reporting with respect to audit. Why are we, for example, allowed to do audits in a financial market communication platform, but we're not allowed to do audits of what's going around in social media? We also have the Chief Operating Officer of Bellingcat coming, and she's going to discuss the value of open source intelligence as an example of how to deal with this. Just to give you some idea of the kinds of people: journalism professors, journalists, about journalistic integrity, regulators, market regulators are coming out as well. And we're going to open actually on day one. We're going to capstone day one with a documentary from a famous actor, Alex Winter. He created a documentary called The YouTube Effect, and so he's going to help open this conference up and discuss the implications and the power of YouTube in this space. For more information, there's a link up in the right if you're interested in attending. We have two ways to attend. You can do a live stream, or you can come in person, and if you need more information, feel free to email me about that. I'm going to now hand over to Brad, who will introduce our presenters around their research, and then I'll go quiet. If you have questions, throw them into the Q&A or the webinar chat, and we'll get them through as we go.
All right, thank you, Alan. I also want to add a couple points about opportunities for research. We're going to talk to two professors here today, but the Journal of Financial Reporting will be calling for papers for a special issue, and I'll be the editor of that, and looking for academics to publish their work in this space. So in addition, I think it's a follow-up to this conference this summer. We're going to be having another one where we're going to look at the academic research itself. And so look for opportunities to reach out to me if you're interested, but we're looking for research, academic research in this space. So it's my pleasure today to welcome two distinguished professors in this space, Marina Niessner and Shimon Kogan. Marina's going to be joining the Indiana University. this fall, but currently is at Wharton. She does research in fintech, cryptocurrencies, and obviously fake news and retail investors, as she's going to talk about today. And also joining her is her co-author Shimon, who is currently at Wharton, and he's been at MIT and does research in behavioral finance and also of course fake news here. So it's a pleasure to have them here. They're going to talk about a very interesting paper that's published in the Review of Finance 2021, social media and financial news manipulation. So I'm going to turn over to them, welcome them, and I look forward to their discussion of this paper. So welcome you both.
Thank you. Should we talk about our research a little bit? Should we start with the paper?
Yeah, sorry. If you want to talk a little bit about if I leave the holes that I left in terms of your background and maybe the things you're working on, and then we can turn it over to the paper. That'd be great. Thank you.
Shimon, do you want to start, and then I'll.
Sure. I mean, I'm sort of broadly interested in the role of information in capital markets and how investors process or misprocess that information. So I think that this joint project that I really enjoy working on with Marina and Toby was very much, consistent with that agenda. We have other joint projects more related to cryptos. I'm starting some new project. We were just talking about this with Anne and Brad about greenwashing, which is sort of a fairly hot form of disinformation these days. So the stakes are high, and if anything, this project I think ages quite well in the sense that this topic is becoming ever more important in the face of generative AI, etc. So with that, I'll let Marina fill in.
Similar to Shimon, that's why we have so many projects together. Always was interested in how information kind of spreads in financial markets and how it affects financial markets. And I think more recently, the overarching interest has been thinking about more retail investors, especially I think we know that social media and we also, similar to as Shimon mentioned, have projects in cryptocurrencies. A lot of them are now, especially institutional investors, are moving in. And I know institutional investors, there's evidence, also consume social media. But I do think in terms of information consumption by actors, retail investors probably disproportionately consume social media. And also, at least for a while, we're disproportionately trading in cryptocurrencies. And I think I commented more from a household finance perspective. I know in some of these things, retail investors aren't really moving a market outside of maybe GameStop and things like that. They didn't take down Wall Street like they were hoping to, but they do, as a fraction of their own household wealth. That's a huge amount. And so I think understanding how they trade, what information they consume, how they use that information is an important sort of topics for regulators. And as I'll talk about our paper today, I'll point out why I think it's an important topic, especially when there has, I think, some potential policy implications.
I just want to add one thing to that is, and Ellen alluded to this, was this journalist integrity, right? Which I think is really cool about this paper is that's at the heart of this paper, right? The integrity of the journalist or people that write articles right on these social media websites. So the role of they play, and also maybe the role that auditors could play in some way of we talk about verification and how do we know what we're reading is truth, and you're going to speak to that, but that's also I think very related to this integrity issue that we're going to talk about. So.
Mm-hmm. Should I talk about the paper?
Please do, yeah.
Okay, perfect. I'm gonna show some slides, not too many formulas, but just so everybody can see what I'm talking about. So let me share this and go to the slideshow. Can you guys see this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. So this is the kind of title of the talk, and this is joint work, obviously, with Shimon, and also Shimon mentioned our third co-author, Toby, who couldn't be here today. And basically, the idea of the paper is that, and I think I want to definitely highlight this. social media is not all bad. Sometimes I think we kind of have that connotation. So on the one hand, it obviously completely revolutionized information production and financial market. For the longest time, it was only journalists and maybe analysts who could produce financial information. And now it's, anybody can do that. But obviously, so that's, I think, a good thing. But on the other hand, the downside is obviously it makes it much easier potentially to spread fraudulent information. And that's what we study in our paper. And we actually have two questions in the paper, and I'll talk a little bit about the first one, but I mostly want to talk about the second one. So first, we'll look at whether fake news even has an effect on financial markets. So we show that especially for small firms, indeed, it can actually affect returns because there are fewer analysts and journalists that are covering it. But the second one, I think, is especially more important for regulators. We'll look at whether, if you make it very salient to people that there is potential fraudulent information on social media, whether that affects their behavior. Because again, now it's the SEC and I think other regulatory bodies are thinking about how to potentially try to warn investors that there's fraudulent or there can be fraudulent information. And so I think it's important to understand whether there can even be an effect of some of these warnings. So as I mentioned, I'm going to mostly focus on the second question. But first, I want to kind of go back a little bit and talk about how could one even identify fraudulent information. And just in the paper, we'll focus, now obviously there are tons of social media websites, Twitter, stock tweets, Facebook, Seeking Alpha, et cetera. So we focus on Seeking Alpha and Motley Fool, partially because unlike stock tweets and Twitter, the format is actually you write a long article, usually several pages, and it can sometimes look similar to what an analyst kind of report might look like. So this is what we're focused on. And the methodology we use, we were basically curious whether there's a way to tell whether someone is lying. And it turns out there is. So we know we can have some ways to tell whether someone is lying, usually using a lie detector test. So you heart rate changes, you sweat, etc. Well, it turns out you can also tell whether someone is lying by the way their speech changes. And we did not come up with this. This is Professor James Pennebaker, who is a very famous linguistic psychologist at UT Austin. He has been studying linguistics for a long time, and he has come up with several methods to detect fraudulent kind of writing. And it's in particular, it's important. It's writing where the person is like knowingly deceiving. So it's not necessarily you saying something that you thought was true and that ex post it turned out wrong. It's you knowingly are telling not the truth. And he came up, and I think, Brad, you've mentioned this already, with this software called Luke that provides a lot of different outputs analyzing the language. And one of them is this authenticity score. And he has been covered by New York Times. He's worked with the FBI before. So these methods have been tested sort of in other areas. And one of the categories, as I mentioned, is this authenticity score. The final formula is proprietary, but to give you some sense kind of what methods he uses, he looks at words that are not nouns, that are kind of not functional words that basically we use very subconsciously, like I, we, but, though. That's actually very hard for us to control. And to give you one example, so most people, it turns out, don't like lying. So if you really love lying, maybe this won't work for you. But we like to distance ourselves from our lies. And so when we're lying, we use fewer self-referencing words. Just to give you an example, and when I was presenting this recently, I realized how old we're getting. This example is a little bit older. It's by Anthony Weiner, which, a couple of years back. So when he was lying, he said, we know for sure I didn't send this photograph. We don't know where the photograph came from. We don't know for sure what's on it. So he was using a lot of we words. And then when he was apologizing and telling the truth, he said, I would like to make it clear that I have made terrible mistakes, that I have hurt the people I care about. So Jamie Pennebaker looks at things like that, kind of how we use, for example, I versus we. And these are small cues that he then combines into this authenticity score. The question that we faced was, Jamie is not a financial economist, and he developed these methods using court cases, using personal essays. And a lot of these natural language processing methods, they're very subject specific. So only because something works when you write in your diary, it does not mean that it will work also when you're talking about Apple stock. And so we needed a test sample to make sure his method works. And we got a bit lucky. There was a scandal on Seeking Alpha in 2014, where it turned out small companies were paying PR firms to contact authors on Seeking Alpha to write promotional articles about those companies. And they were truly fraudulent information, like saying, for example, there's a drug that's being developed and it's very promising, even though the author knew that all the R&D efforts for that drug has stopped a while ago. And then one of the people they contacted was this guy, Rick Pearson, and he went underground. He documented a bunch of communication and he turned it over to the SEC. And the SEC filed several large lawsuits after that, because obviously non-disclosing payment for writing articles is illegal. And there were a bunch of settlements. And so we contacted Rick Pearson in the SEC, and they handed over 171 for sure fake articles, and 334, or we found 334 articles by the same authors that were most likely non-fake. They were written a long time ago when they were still building up their reputation. And so we wanted to see, and we had our perfect test sample, and we wanted to see whether James's method would work. And it worked beautifully. So here are the 170, so authenticity score, the higher it is, so it's from 0 to 100, the more authentic your language sounds, so the less likely you're lying. So we can see that there were 171 articles, and they had a much lower authenticity score than what we call sort of the non-fake articles, which was quite similar to just all articles on Seeking Alpha, which hopefully the majority are sort of not fraudulent. So we can see the score definitely works, and this difference is statistically significant. I'm not going to go through a bunch of math. We actually in our paper provide cutoffs for this authenticity score that I know now other papers have used successfully to identify which articles are sort of maybe for sure fake versus then there's a gray area and most likely non-fake. So if anybody's interested, you can look at our paper. So this gave us confidence that Jamie's method didn't just work in criminal court cases, but also worked in financial writing. And so with that in tow, we did kind of some analysis to see whether fake articles affect the markets, et cetera. And then, as I mentioned, the second question that we wanted to know was, to know the answer to was, if you make it very salient to people that there may be fraudulent information, does that change our behavior? And you might expect it might not, right? You might say, well, I know there's probably fraudulent information on Twitter. Right? Not everything is true. So if you just tell me today, well, Marina, do you realize there's fraudulent information on there? That maybe shouldn't change my behavior. And so we were curious if it does or does not. And here we used, again, the same experiment or the same scandal that I just mentioned. And this was the company that was at the heart of this SEC lawsuit that really blew everything up was this Galena Biopharma. And this graph is actually based on the lawsuit documents that SEC filed. They did a fantastic job. I will give them that, documenting everything. So what we see is a timeline of late 2013 to early 2014. And these are fake articles that the SEC documented in green squares that were coming out about Galena Biopharma. And you can see the stock price on the y-axis. So at least eyeballing it, it looks like it's working. Articles were coming out and the price is going up and up and up. And then early 2014, this is where the blue triangles came in. The insiders got greedy and started dumping a bunch of shares. So it's a kind of traditional pump and dump scheme. And in red is when we call it expose articles, when Rick kind of started this whole SEC investigation. Several large articles also in the Wall Street Journal came out documenting that this problem was happening. And so these are 2 months where it became very salient to people who are following this, that there was these fraudulent articles on Seeking Alpha. And it ended, the last red cross here is when the Galena Biopharma had to do an SEC filing that they were under SEC investigation. And so we used these 2 months of basically people on Seeking Alpha, and also there were articles on Seeking Alpha, kind of started to get bombarded with these newspaper articles saying that there's fraudulent information on these websites. And so we looked at, so we used this kind of expose period, and we looked at 6 months before and 6 months after to see whether people changed how much they trust just an average article on Seeking Alpha. Basically, once it became so salient to them early 2014 that there's fraudulent information on that, did they start trusting it less? And one way to test it is to look at the volume reaction of trading volume to these articles. Because basically, if you think you might mistrust the information more, you would maybe trade less based on the information that comes out in these articles. And now you'll see some regressions. Basically, what we did was we looked at the abnormal trading volume on the left-hand side as a reaction to one of these articles on Seeking Alpha. And first, we can see that there is an effect. So when a Seeking Alpha article comes out, controlling for a lot of other things, we see that the trading volume goes up, and especially so for smaller firms, which makes sense because they're usually less covered than traditional media sources. And what we see here is that in the 6 months after, compared to the 6 months before the scandal, the effect is smaller. So, and it's pretty significant. It's about 10%. So people started trading less as a response to a Seeking Alpha article in the time period after this kind of scandal came to light compared to before. And this effect was especially large for smaller firms, suggesting that people, especially in small firms, again, where there's a lot less transparency, kind of shied away even more from trusting Seeking Alpha articles. And again, this to me suggests that people, even though they might be somewhere deep inside aware that there's fraudulent information on these websites, seem to be less critical until it becomes more salient to them that there is potential misinformation there. And just to get a little bit more, I mean, we obviously do a lot of tests in the paper, so if people want to see them, they're there. One thing we wanted to kind of do a bit of a sanity check. So on Seeking Alpha, people can write articles and then they can provide a lot of comments. And we wanted to see whether people's language and comments changed after the scandal. In particular, whether they were writing more often that something is fake or fraudulent. So we looked at a bunch of words that are related to kind of fake. And we compared that to the usage of the word just wrong. Like, if you disagree with something in the article, are you saying it's because it's fake, or are you saying it's because it's just wrong? And we saw that after the scandal, so in the 6 months after compared to the 6 months before, the usage of kind of the words fake went up in comments, and the usage of kind of the words wrong or disagreeing hasn't changed. So people, I think this provides us some evidence for the mechanism that people really started to kind of mistrust, in the sense, worrying that there's potentially fake news on these websites compared to just disagreeing with the information provided. And we also look at some kind of whether trust mattered here, and we see that the drop in trust seemed to be smaller if authors had more followers, have written more articles before. Basically, this especially hit kind of newer authors that haven't had a chance to build up their reputation yet. And the last thing I want to tell you guys about, so in case you're wondering kind of what are potential some implications, I do think that there is a very important implication into whether the regulators might consider maybe kind of including more warnings or disclosures for people. And this is not a crazy idea. So I apologize for the German version. Shimon and I have worked with this company called eToro, which is an international version of Robinhood. And so I was in Germany this past summer, and also in England, I think they're everywhere. When I was in Oxford last week, like the ads were everywhere. And here, this is in Germany, this was in YouTube, and the guy was basically telling them how much money he made, that everybody should trade with eToro, and this is, a great thing. And then suddenly I noticed in red, and I will translate this, there was a disclosure saying 68% of all small accounts lose money on this website. So as part of their ad, I assume they have to do this, I assume this wasn't voluntary. I think the EU requires that they disclose how many people actually lose money being on this app. And so I'm not saying this is necessarily the way to go, but given the evidence that we have in the paper, I think it does affect people's behavior when you remind them that there might be fraudulent information on Twitter, Seeking Alpha, et cetera. And so I think there might be some benefits from having more disclosures. Like in the most recent scandal with Kim Kardashian, the only disclosure she made that she had a paid promotion was somewhere in the corner, it was a hashtag ad. And so I think the bigger question is, how do regulators deal with this and what type of disclosures we might provide? With that, I will stop talking. Thank you. I will stop sharing.
Thank you for that, Marina. That's really interesting. I'll start with, I'll say the motivation for the journalist, right? That seems to be one of the questions I had is, what motivation do they have to engage in this? Is it compensation or reputation? Why would they want to do this? Do you have any sense of the role of the journalist here and the integrity of the journalist? That seems to be again, the firm reached out to the journalist to write something, right? That's how this process started.
You mean on Seeking Alpha specifically?
Yeah, Seeking Alpha. Yeah, exactly. Can you walk us through how you think this goes down?
Sure. So, I mean, I think that, well, first of all, I mean, this is sort of kind of like in crypto, it's pseudo-anonymous in the sense that articles are actually signed by a handle, and so there are potentially incentives to build reputation. And we kind of, at least anecdotally, know that people who build reputation were able to monetize on that outside of Seeking Alpha. Seeking Alpha also had some scheme, and Marina, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but if I recall, they also had some way of compensating authors that had a large and sort of stable readership directly monetarily. So I mean, I think that there are some, as economists, I think we can. It's not hard to see how you can monetize on that. I'm also sure that there were others that were just sort of passionate about, about stocks in the same way that people contribute to open source, right? Partially because they build and monetize reputation, and partially because they're just sort of passionate about the topic. So I think it's a mixture of that. I mean, I don't think we have a very good breakdown, right? In terms of what is the composition of authors, how to distinguish between those two. But I would point to these two.
Do you have a sense of sort of what happens to these authors then? And I think maybe you did some post stuff in terms of their reaction to their articles, but I guess in legally or career-wise, do you have a sense of what happens to the journalists?
You mean whether the SEC actually went after?
Yeah, exactly. Do they go after the journalists themselves?
So they have.
Well?
They have. Yeah. So they went after. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's how they were able to catch them. So it turns out that it's very hard to persecute somebody for lying because of free speech, right? Exposed, like, did you actually lie or were you just misinformed? The thing that they were able to catch them on, you have to disclose when you're paid to write something, especially by the company. And that is how they were able to actually sue them. And then they ended up settling. But so the payment was actually a very important part of the SEC investigation.
And that's, if I remember right, in your appendix, you have, data on what all of these authors did not disclose. That's the key thing. They didn't disclose that they were paid. That's
right.
Okay.
That's legally the violation. That's right.
Exactly.
Alan, do you want to follow up?
Yeah. So first, I'm going to invite the audience to throw questions in the Q&A box or in the chat if you have some. So if I understand your data or your results correctly, the informed investors, like the sophisticated investors, they weren't affected by anything happening over there. Do you have a sense for whether they're actually paying attention to that or whether they could see through it? And then from a regulatory perspective, if they aren't affected by it, then the SEC, should the SEC get involved? That's something that they should care about. This self-selection is a question I have.
I think we have little evidence. We have some anecdotal evidence on how much that institutional investors are consuming this information on social media, but we don't obviously know the extent, like the breakdown of the readership. We did see that, especially for small firms, and you might say, well, the institutional investors are less involved there. There is a pretty strong market effect. So the price is definitely higher than it should be. Following a fake news article, and they're all positive in this case. And then it takes quite a while to revert. So from that sense, I do think the majority of people affected by these schemes are probably, at least in the past, were retail investors. Maybe with ChatGPT and some other AI, institutional investors might be able to get fooled easier. I don't know that institutional investors are less likely to be fooled, because I think we have a lot of evidence that most people cannot tell the difference between fraudulent and non-fraudulent information. Maybe they're more rely on sources like analyst reports and things like that, which are probably less likely to be fraudulent. But in terms of the regulators, I absolutely think that the regulators should care about it, just because, again, it might not be the amount of money that at stake, but as a fraction of people's wealth. I guess I personally am very passionate about retail investors, just because I think they put a lot of their money off. We now saw from Reddit their 401k retirement accounts or whatever on the line for this. And I think if we can avoid all these people from, or help prevent these people from being duped, I think that's a very worthy cause for the regulators.
Yeah, I'll add to that, one of the things that are sort of, as Marina said, I mean, we don't have a direct way, we don't have an account level kind of trading data on retail versus institutions, so it's hard to answer your question directly. We do see that we see sort of the role of reputation for sure, right? So for example, when we look at similar tests for Wall Street Journal, right, articles, we don't see an effect before and after, right? So to the extent that you want to associate retail institutional trading with those more reputable sources, that's consistent with that. I mean, that's point number one. Kind of more related to the big picture, to follow up on Marina's point, I think that one of the disheartening aspects of this project is that this is sort of a domain where people have very direct incentives to consume truth, right? And despite that, they've had a really hard time doing so. And so I think that sort of kind of back to the question, big picture policy questions about how you regulate that space. I mean, I think that if you go beyond the security laws and SEC, I mean, I think that sort of puts a very high burden in other domains where people don't have necessarily either the incentive to consume the truth or the immediate feedback, right, to figure out whether they're doing something right or wrong. So I think that sort of, when you move them away from trading and into more sort of political or social spheres, I think that sort of that's a cautionary tale, right? Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, one thing I think I took away from the paper was when trust is lost, which this paper is about trust. It's the whole market is. I mean, the whole market becomes also not inefficient, but. Would we go as far as to say it becomes inefficient from a behavioral perspective? Like there's less trading, there's less interest. Could there be opportunity to think about a shock to the whole market and what that means for society if we interject, misinformation into our systems? What does that mean for the market in general? Do you have a thought on that?
I mean, it's hard. I mean, we fortunately weren't able to run that experiment, right? Yeah. But if sort of you go back to the to kind of post depression era, right? I mean, this is sort of the foundation of the SEC and many of the security laws that we have and disclosure, etc. I mean, is that information and disclosure, truthful disclosure, really matter, right? Again, I don't. Being careful academics, I don't think that we can actually draw from this, sort of extrapolate what would have happened, right, if there was basically no truthful information production in capital market. We haven't run that experiment, but like this is on the margin, right, relatively small, right, in the kind of grand scheme of things. Yet we see a fairly economically large, as Marina pointed out, economic impact on trading, both volatility and volume, right? So even though you kind of, if I were to guess, right, how much information is being produced through seeking alpha out of the total fraction of information production, I would venture to guess that it's rather small. Yet the effect is quite noticeable. So
So do you have a sense, and Marina, you may have mentioned this, do you have a sense of how many, given the model you introduced there, how many would you estimate to be potentially fake from Seeking Alpha's large number of articles? Do you have a number you could share? Or?
I think in the paper we have, and I think that's a lower bound because we're being quite conservative, but we don't know how much higher it is than the lower bound. I think we have about 4% of the articles, which is a fairly non-significant fraction.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the review process? So we have academics on the call here, the webinar, that may want to enter the space. Can you talk about 2 or 3 things that you consistently faced, that you had to overcome, and that you would sort of give direction to someone that might want to do research in this space as to what you're hearing from other academics, editors, in this area? What were your hurdles?
Well, I mean, I think actually, so it was kind of an interesting journey because we started working on this right before. I mean, just like that sort of like dates us, right? I mean, but actually before Trump was elected, right? So either because or independent of that, we actually got a lot of interest in the paper and got into truly all the basic top finance conferences, right? Multiple NBR presentations. So we had great coverage, and great hope for the paper, but again, I think that this sort of that election and the whole discussion around fake news with former President Trump was sort of a mixed blessing for us, right? Because I think initially it may have generated extra attention, and then later on it sort of somehow people, I don't know if it maybe subconsciously associated our paper with sort of fake news and with the sort of distaste with fake news. So I think later on the publication or the review process with journals was a mixed bag. I mean, we're very happy with the review finance publication, but it wasn't sort of like a kind of knocking it out of the park type situation.
Yeah, and I think, and now the fact that more papers have been published in this area, I think will also help establish the methodology a little bit more. I think there was definitely a lot of skepticism around measuring fake news. And honestly, I think because it was based on social media, and as you asked, well, like, does social media even matter? Should we regulate it if it's retail investors? I think we ended up in this bit of a lull period between kind of when people got first excited about social media and GameStop, where I think people, and kind of what's happening now, right? Yeah. So I think, yeah, we unfortunately ended up trying to publish it in this kind of lull where I think also people were like, oh, there was an early hype about social media, but nothing came off it. So why do we care about this? And then, 2020, 21 happened after that.
Yeah. I mean, I want to follow up on the journalist. A key player in your paper was getting this data from Rick, right? Rick Pearson. So can you speak to your interactions with him? What is he doing, or what role did he play, or how did you get to know him, and yeah.
I think we unearthed, again, as Shimon mentioned this many years ago, but I think we came across some of these articles, as I mentioned, that were published around 2014, 15, as we were researching more about Seeking Alpha, et cetera. And we contacted him, and he basically, I think, has done some short selling as well. So I think for some people, it kind of has colored him a bit. But when basically he was contacted, as I mentioned, to write these promotional articles, I assume maybe he has this consciousness, but he basically decided to turn it over to the SEC rather than pursue that. And when we contacted him, he was very friendly. He just shared the data, like the articles with us that he has collected. And I think his interest was he spent a lot of resources trying to collect this. So the more attention this could get and the more people realize what is happening was definitely something he was looking for. I'm sure we told him the paper will get published soon. 5 years later, but that process. So I'm not sure what he's doing right now.
Right.
So I have a quick question. You mentioned that there was sort of a disclaimer about the 68% negative thing. Do you have a sense for what kind of intervention would actually help prevent this? Because the SEC doesn't have the capacity to do a lot of regulatory work here. So does a disclosure like that, like, hey, if you follow my advice, you're going to lose money? Or, I mean, is there some way to, or even the score mechanism that you're using, is there an intervention that could help here?
I think the scoring will be a little harder, and I do want to kind of highlight that. And the scoring in writing could become a victim of its own success.
Yeah, kind
As
of a
this
loomis
becomes
critic,
more
right?
popular, then people can use Look themselves, and right, you can imagine how that will start working at some point. And in ways of disclosure, I think there definitely is a balancing act in the sense that on the one hand, we show that it does make people a little bit more cautious. But to what Brad said earlier, you don't want to overdo it because we do want investors to participate in financial markets, and maybe we could also just make them only trade 5 ETFs. That's probably not the best solution. So, and I know there's some work in experimental space where they're trying to see where maybe some cues, rather this kind of bland instrument with disclosures, different cues help people to get into different types of mindsets, and they might become sometimes more critical of what they're reading. So maybe something like this might be more promising than just discouraging everybody from reading any social media.
And I do think that there is I know of at least one company that is sort of trying to do that called T-Pranks, but I mean, I can see a room here for sort of for opportunities, right? For outsiders to sort of provide an independent, almost judgment of your scorecard, right? So if you go out and you publish or you discuss investments, right? If you have no reputation, I hope that most people will try and shy away. And if you do have a reputation, then with caveats, I mean, this can be observable, right? And so third parties can actually provide a service that potentially could be valuable to retail investors, right? So that could be another. So that's not an intervention in the sense of a regulator stepping in, but markets having incentives to try to kind of close that gap.
Yeah, there's been initiatives like that in journalism to try and get kind of credibility rankings, for example.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's a paper there's a question from the audience here, and the question is, which theory do you think is relevant in this paper? And I know the paper does talk quite a bit about the theory, but you can talk about a couple of them that you would highlight that's relevant to the motivation for the study.
I mean, I don't know that there is anyone sort of wrote a paper that's sort of trying to link that to capital markets. I mean, there are papers that we cite that are looking at how basically a kind of the role of persuasion, right, and reputation building and monetizing persuasion. So in that sense, they fit in the paper. As far as at least I don't know any paper that sort of tries to close this in some sort of capital market equilibrium framework.
Mm-hmm. Great.
So where do we go next? So you mentioned a little bit what you might be doing, Marina, or what are you either of you still engaged in the space? And if so, can you just shed a little bit of light on that, or tell the audience again what you might be doing next?
So I mean, sort of, I mean, a bit indirectly, but Marina and I are starting a new project. We don't have any results. We have a lot of hopes, but we're actually working with a company that is sort of tracking web usage, right? Web traffic. And we're actually looking to more directly measure trading behavior that stems from different forms of information consumption, right? So when you go off of Twitter and you go and trade, kind of collectively, not as an individual, but as a cohort, are your actions different from whether you consume more traditional, maybe financial media, or maybe from Twitter? So that is sort of that is a question that we're trying to answer. I don't know that we have right now very good answers to this question, but it's definitely related to the role of misinformation or disinformation, right?
Yeah, and I have quite a bit of work more generally in social media space, not just kind of limited to fraudulent information. But as you mentioned, I have a project with a couple of co-authors. That's why I brought up the Kim Kardashian case, trying to understand the celebrity, and sometimes not necessarily, it's not directly fraudulent information. It's just them talking about subject matters like cryptocurrencies that they have no expertise in. And we have a lot of evidence. And again, anytime there's a lawsuit, it's great because there's a lot of really good documentation that goes around it. And for example, in Kim Kardashian case, when she was peddling Ethereum Max, which has nothing to do with Ethereum, by the way, the survey found that there was a 20% conversion rate, in the sense of 20% of people who saw her promotion actually bought Ethereum Max. And Exposed, we saw they did not do well. It just went to zero. And so we're trying to understand, we're kind of collecting all these tweets by celebrities and trying to understand, we have some data where we know who is trading, like in terms of demographics, like who is actually buying on this advice, who is losing money, who is making money. Just to kind of, again, not how to prevent it necessarily, but to even understand who is actually affected by these schemes.
I have a pretty provocative question. Have you seen any evidence or have any experience where malignant actors are kind of targeting you or trying to undermine your reputation because you risk exposing them? There's been a lot of documented evidence of that happening to journalists, and particularly female journalists out there who are exposing types of frauds or profiteering around disinformation. Have you seen any evidence of that yet? Or is that something you concern yourself with in doing your work?
I don't think we've experienced that, but I think, I think potentially because these authors are not very well organized. I mean, we're not dealing with sort of a state agent or with a very large corporation that has a lot of stake. I mean, we're basically exposing sort of relatively small scale authors and companies that were engaging in that. So I think that could at least explain why I don't think, I mean, I personally have never experienced anything like that. I don't know if Marina has.
No, and I think it helps that I don't know of any instance, but it's somebody like Rick Pearson, I think, would have been at a much higher chance of being attacked, in the sense that I don't think Shimon, like in our paper, I'm not sure we actually like exposed, we studied the effects on the market, etc. But I want to caution, kind of put in some caution, even with Luke. Like if you use our methodology, it works on averages, right? You can't pinpoint a specific article and just try to sue them and say, like, if it has a low Luke score, oh, this is definitely fake. So even our method works more on statistical averages rather than sort of pinpointing certain people.
There's a question in the chat here from Marina related to your new paper, your new project. There's interest in it. So the question is, for the new paper, which is the one you mentioned, I think maybe for both the new paper you're both working on, will the impact of different platforms such as YouTube, Twitter, Reddit, etc., on trading decisions be explored?
That's exactly the idea.
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to. That's what we're trying to answer.
Okay. Great. Anything else, Alan? You have other?
Open it back up to the audience if you have any other questions.
I mean, this is a technical question, because in this paper we talk about, and throughout this conversation, we talk about institutional and retail investors. How as an accountant, I have a hard time understanding how I'm able to disentangle those two. So what's the latest and the methodology you use in your future papers or in this one in terms of getting that difference and be able to speak to one or the other?
It varies. So for a paper that Shimon and I have on, based on the Satora data that I mentioned there, we really observe, it's like getting Robinhood data, right? Where you know these are retail investors and you can observe every trade they have, et cetera. For the fake news paper and some other papers that have been written in the space, we use what's been now known as the BJCC method. Which you basically look at individual trades, and there's certain markers. I'm not going to go through the boring details, but there's certain markers where you look at all trades in the market that you can try to identify retail trading. Since then, there's now several papers that came out more recently, I think, saying that method works, but there are some caveats that are associated with it. So as you mentioned, I mean, as you can imagine in finance as well, any measure that can separate retail investors from non-retail investors is extremely valuable. So there's, I think, a lot of cool work happening in that space now, but depending when you look in the past 2 or 3 years, there might have been sort of a different method that was the favorite one.
And also NASDAQ, I mean, it's not free. They sell stock day level measure of kind of both directional and non-directional order flow. That is sort of trying to specifically pick up retail investor trading.
Awesome, thank you.
So I have a question. Do you have a sense for how much the regulators are actually actively looking into the social media space and monitoring it? Because I mean, there's so much in our world with the audited financial reports and the management discussion analysis stuff that they spend a lot of time with comment letters, et cetera. How much energy and how much focus are they putting in that space? Because it seems like that's going to take a lot of technology and a lot of training for them to spin up and kind of police that. Do you have a sense for their appetite and their capability?
I don't have a sense what fraction of their overall resources they're obviously dedicating to this. Again, I definitely know in this celebrity space, there was quite a bit of action. There were several lawsuits, and I know Gary Gensler has on YouTube our office hours with Gary Gensler, where he very much like talks about to be careful, there's fraudulent information here. I know there's several of my co-authors have a cool paper that just came out showing that Twitter might have contributed and exaggerated the more recent bank runs that we have seen. So I think the regulators are definitely paying attention. I think, and most of my work actually is with Twitter and stock tweets. And I think there it's much harder to identify fraudulent information because the messages are very short. So even the method, Luke, that we used would not work well there. So, but I think the number of people who are obviously using Twitter and things like that and get their information there is immense, including institutional investors. And we have evidence, right, where there's somebody posts something wrong about a company on Twitter. There are many anecdotes like that in the market for that company that crashes or goes up. So there's definitely, and there that has to mean institutional investors, right? These are large companies that are being affected. And so I can't speak to how much they're already spending efforts on it, but I think that's definitely something they're watching.
I'll just add one. I had an interesting discussion with a partner on a major company in the United States where they have audit team has sort of capabilities and they're looking for fake, I'll say, fake news about the company to try to figure out how to address it, right? To be aware of it and whether they should address it and how they address it. So it seems like the firm is also trying to do things to stop this, in addition to regulators obviously being out there as well. So I think there's resources put into it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's worth noting that Seeking Alpha was very much collaborated with us, right? And philosophically, and I think probably economically as well, they were trying to carve out this phenomena. So they definitely did not want to see this happening. So so back to sort of institutions responding to that, they were definitely on the side of trying to see it go away.
We should definitely give Seeking Alpha credit for, and one of the first articles that when that scandal broke was published on Seeking Alpha, sort of warning investors. And actually, since 2012 until then, it used to be the case that you could just click if you got payment for it and still publish something. And since 2012, they've actually banned that on Seeking Alpha, even though you can still be deceptive about it. But Seeking Alpha and those websites are very proactive about trying to root that out.
I was going to say, I see this as a huge growth space for our profession, for accounting particularly. And I think things like the proliferation of algorithmic audits that are going to go into some of the digital services type legislation and things like monitoring. I know some of the people who are coming to our Disinformation Summit in July are working on small organizations that are trying to work with corporates and NGOs and government agencies to try to at least help police the landscape and get on top of this type of stuff, whether it's financial markets or product market type manipulation. We have one more from the audience. After the release of fake or non-fake articles, audited financial statements may follow, allowing investors to verify the accuracy of the news. Could this potentially lead to decreased main effect 6 months later? So there's like a revelation, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think that's the case. So just to highlight, we're looking at all articles on Seeking Alpha. So we're not just looking at the reaction to fraudulent articles, just because we have a lot of evidence to tell them, or no investor can tell them apart, no human. So we're looking at just any time a Seeking Alpha article came out on social media, or Seeking Alpha in particular, in the 6 months after, was there a different effect? And I don't think that the corporations or audited financial statements were sort of addressing every article in Seeking Alpha in that time span.
I will just add, though, your future colleague there at Indiana, Betty Liu and Austin Moss, have a paper that look at the role of accounting information to prevent fake news from being written. So that's a paper on SSRN, the role of accounting information in the era of fake news. That is related to your point that what role can accounting play, and it may help prevent it, as opposed to the back end of what you're mentioning there. So I think there's opportunities in the space for accounting to help be also a regulator in this sense, or stop it. So this has been fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us. This is great. And
thanks for having us.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for including our paper.
No, for sure. We look forward to having more of this discussion at the conference. Alan, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I really appreciate Marina and Shimon, you joining us. And just to illustrate the kinds of work that we're going to do at the summit. The summit is just an opportunity to convene people together from different space to have discussions like this. Like some of the issues that came up even in our talk is sort of where's the line on regulation of these types of social media and the impacts, the societal impacts that go beyond the financial markets. If you're interested in attending, there's a list of our speakers up here. And I should make it clear that after the summit is designed to bring people together so that we can actually do active work afterwards. It's not simply we're going to all get together and talk and leave. I think there's a lot of potential synergies for new access to data sources, new research and collaborative curriculum development and projects, stuff like this. So if you're interested, please come attend. And I appreciate everybody's coming to this event. We will actually put this on YouTube if you're interested in revisiting this. Thank you again, Marina and Shimon, for your time and for your insights from the paper. And we look forward to hosting you again for another round when you get your new projects out. Perfect. So thank you, everybody else, for attending. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.